The Plainstone's Elgin, centre of this ancient royal borough since the 12th century. Here, on the 25th of January, thousands gathered to commemorate the centenary of the birth of Scotland's greatest poet, Robert Burns. The local trades paraded their flags, the bands played, verses were recited, and speeches were delivered. Today, we continue to celebrate the words, works, and enduring legacy of Robert Burns, not only here in Scotland, but across the world, and not least through Burns suppers. Alas, in 2021, because of the COVID-19 pandemic, our Burns commemorations require to be different. Our Burns supper cannot take place, but the Elgin Burns Club can still celebrate and share the life of the man who, some 224 years after his death, still speaks to us directly through the apparent simplicity of his lines, and who so effectively touches our hearts while strengthening our understanding of our fellow humans. Hence, we start as Burns' life did in Alloway. We visit Dumfries, where his last too few years were spent. We stop in Edinburgh to share with Burns his admiration for the poet Robert Ferguson. And then we follow the best laid schemes of Burns and his drouthy companion William Nicol as they travel through the Highlands between the 25th of August and the 16th of September 1787, including a stop in Elgin. But to our tale.
William Burns came from Kincardineshire in the northeast of Scotland via Edinburgh here to Ayrshire to work as a market gardener. So in 1756 he managed to few 7 acres of land at an annual cost of £6 sterling. That same year, a very busy year, he married Agnes Brune, while at the same time building a button ben comprising a room and a kitchen. Now the construction was simple, clay and stones, and the original roof was probably of turf and the floor simply beaten earth. However, William had by this time been appointed head gardener to William Ferguson, the Provost of Ayr, so he was able to turn his property into a small holding instead. On January the 25th, 1759, Robert, their firstborn, came into the world here in the cottage, which, as you can see, is now a national monument. The cottage later became the Burns Head Inn, where the first Burns supper was held in 1801.
Burns first visited Dumfries in June 1787 during his tour of the borders. Because of his recent success as a poet, he was immediately made an honorary burgess. In 1791, he settled in Dumfries and lived there until his death.
You know, there are 60 statues worldwide of Robert Burns. This one is one of my favourite by far. And you know, there are also more than 20 memorials to Robert Burns throughout Scotland itself. It is so like the Burns that I thought that I decided that this was a great place to come to start another journey with Burns. Burns was an enigma, but he was quite a remarkable man, and it's often said that his most productive years were when he was here in Dumfries. He was a freeman of the town of Dumfries, and as we all know, he's buried not far from where I'm standing today in his mausoleum in Dumfriesshire. I would like you to come and meet somebody else though, who knows much more about Dumfries and indeed much more about Robert Burns than I do.
Well, he moved to Elgin Farm initially, and the house at Elgin wasn't quite habitable, so he lodged here in the Globe to wait to get the house kind of refurbished, as homes under the hammer would be these days. But unfortunately Elgin didn't work out for him. The ground was stony, the crops didn't grow very well, and he moved into the town eventually to a flat down what they call Bank Street now, and ended up in the old mill in Burn Street, which is now called Burn Street here. But the job he had in Dumfries when he moved was as an excise man, because Dumfries was a very flourishing market town then, and the port of Carsthorne, which is down the Solway coast, was a busier port than Port Glasgow and Liverpool for tobacco trade and immigration. So it's hard to believe when you go now, it's a very little hamlet with a little pub in it, and that's about all. But that's where everyone emigrated from. They would come down from the Crofts, probably up by yourself, never been away from the farm, and come here maybe via the Globe. They'd maybe stay overnight or catch a carriage here or walk. So the Globe itself would be so exciting, but that's why Burns was so busy in this area as an excise man, and he rode 200 miles a week, sometimes on the pony. And people wonder why he died so young. You know, there's no Range Rovers in those days, bless him. But that was his busy period as an excise man, educating his children and writing some of his most productive works, as you can imagine. And I ran the Globe as much as we had a busy bar and the usual rugby boys coming in and diners coming in and open till 1 in the morning and everything. This side of it was always still very much seeped in Burns, and the Burns House Club, they have their meeting room upstairs, the bedrooms upstairs where Burns etched on the windows, the chair here that sits in the corner where it was reported that Burns would come in and read the newspapers that had come up by coach from London or down from Glasgow, and people that couldn't read would come in and listen to the news of the day, and it would go around, Burns is in the building, like Elvis is in the building, and everybody would come rushing in to hear what he had to say. And he had the affair with Anna Park upstairs, and she gave birth to a baby girl 9 days before his wife Jean gave birth to a son. And Anna died eventually, and the child was brought back to Jean Armour, who brought the baby up with her own children, most compassionate. And a wee story is, I used to always recite when I did the tours of Yestrina had a pint of wine, a place where body sauna. Yestreen lay on this breast of mine, the gowden locks of Anna. Come in thy raven plumage night, sun, moon and stars withdrawna, and bring an angel pen to write, my transport way, my Anna.
Edina, Scotia's darling seat, all hail thy palaces and towers. Burns arrived in Edinburgh on the 28th of November 1786. The next 6 months were formative to the rest of his life. One of his first acts was to visit the poet Robert Ferguson's graveside, which he found unmarked.
If you walk down Edinburgh's High Street and go through the wrought iron gates of Canongate Kirkyard, you've entered into one of Edinburgh's most venerable cemeteries. Provosts, professors, and moderators lie there. Adam Smith is buried there, as is Clorinda, to whom A Fond Kiss was dedicated. And there is a tomb to the poet Robert Ferguson, and an inscription written by Robert Burns himself. It reads, O thou, my elder brother in misfortune, by far my elder brother in the Mews. Walk back out the gates and you will see a statue erected only 16 years ago of the young Robert Ferguson striding confidently down the high street. Robert Ferguson was Burns' inspiration. He was his muse. He had died aged 24, a full 12 years before Burns arrived in Edinburgh. They never met. For a few brief years, Ferguson's star had shone as the poet laureate in Enlightenment Edinburgh. Then his drinking, his bohemian lifestyle, his fragile mental health, and his poverty combined to destroy him. He died in the asylum, a broken, abandoned man. Burns was inspired by Ferguson to keep alive the Scots vernacular of the ploughman, the cotter, the father, the farmer, the churchman, and use words that they understood or that any lass could take to her heart.
August 1787, and Burns is back in the capital. He is lodging at the home of his good friend William Nicol, a school teacher well versed in malt. To Burns, Nicol is kind-hearted Willie. To almost everyone else, he is vain, touchy and irascible. Good friends they may be, but perhaps not ideal travelling companions. 25th August 1787. I leave Edinburgh for a northern tour in company with my good friend Mr. Nicol. They travel in a chaise. Nicol thinks it more comfortable than horseback, to which I say Amen. Burns will keep a diary of his journey, making notes as he travels along, but these will turn out fragmentary and disjointed, just like the roads. They are heading north and literally passing into history. Come to Bannockburn, shown the old house where James III was murdered, the hall where glorious Bruce set up the standard. Here no Scot can pass uninterested. Came to Stirling, viewed the ruins of the great hall at Stirling Castle. From Stirling he travels to Crieff and onwards to Kenmore, the words written by him on the chimney piece of the inn there, reflecting his experiences. Admiring nature in her wildest grace, these northern scenes with weary feet I trace. Then down the Tay via Aberfeldy to Dunkeld. At Dunkeld he meets the celebrated fiddler-composer Neil Gow, a short, stout-built, honest Highland figure. Unfortunately, Burns was then quickly prized away from their meeting by an increasingly impatient Nicol. And then it was up the Tummel, Fascally, a beautiful romantic nest, wild grandeur of the pass of Killiecrankie, visit the Lord Dundee's stone, and then to Blair Athol. Burns was invited to sup and sleep at Athol House, Blair Castle. Crucially, Nicol was not. The Duke's young family attract much of Burns' admiration, and he drinks their health. The 2 days spent at Blair on 31st August and 1st September are later regarded by Burns as among the happiest days of his life. Rhyme is the coin with which a poet pays his debts of honour or gratitude. What I owe to the noble family of Athol, I shall ever proudly boast. Nicol, who had not been invited to the castle, spent some time fishing on the Tilt and the Garry. But with no fishing on the Sunday, Nicol was impatient to be off, dragging Burns away from an invitation to the castle. Indeed, the Duke's family tried to bribe the coachman to delay, but to no effect. They set off north, up the Garry.
This fine retail emporium will be known to many through food and fashion, but the history behind this 21st century landmark is where we find the next secret on our journey. When walking up to the falls, Burns may have been reflecting on his recent journey, perhaps time in Edinburgh, or maybe recent hospitality with the Duke. One thing's for certain, the beauty of this place certainly caught his attention. After visiting, he was inspired to write a poem called The Humble Petition of Brewer Water. Not a particularly well-known poem today, but one where he takes the persona of the burn. In 1787, there were no trees here, something Burns strongly disapproved of. In the poem, he goes on to encourage the Duke to invest in such decoration of the landscape. A great example of his environmentalist perspective, wanting to see landscape enhancements and providing a home for birds and other wildlife. The lightly jumping glowering trouts that through my waters play, if in their random wanton spouts they near the margin stray, if hapless chance they linger lang, I'm scorching up so shallow, they left the whitening stones amang, and gasping death to wallow. Last day I grat wi' spite and teen, as poet Burns came by, that to a bard I should be seen, wi' half my channel dry. A panegyric rhyme, a ween, even as I was, he shored me, but had I in my glory been, he kneeling would adore me. Here foaming down the skelvy rocks, and twisting strength are in, there high my boiling torrent smokes, wild roaring o'er a linn. Enjoying each large spring and well, as nature gave than me, I am, although I say myself, worth going a mile to see. While Burns would have been travelling in a very different manner to us today, I'm sure he would have appreciated the ever-expanding emporium that shares its name with this beautiful part of Scotland. Perhaps he would have done some shopping before diligently sticking to the speed limit while heading north. Not the kind of points any of us really want.
Dalnacardoch, Dalwhinnie, Dine, snow on the hills, 17 feet deep. The warmth of the reception at Dalwhinnie thawed the frozen travellers, prompting Burns to pen, when death's dark stream I ferry o'er, a time that surely shall come. In heaven itself I'll ask no more than just a Highland welcome. The welcome over, the journey north continued. Cross the Spey and come down the stream to Pitnane, Canusi's old name. Straths rich, Ruthven of Badenoch, barracks wild and magnificent, Rothiemurchus, Strathspey rich and romantic, Aviemore, a wild spot, some things never change. Dine at Sir James Grant, a sweet, pleasant body, come through mist and darkness to Dulcie to lie, Findhorn River, rocky banks. It was a foul evening, and the intrepid travellers sought shelter for the night at the King's House Inn, now a farmhouse.
You'll be wondering why Willie, Nicol and I have arrived at this part of the journey on a bicycle. Back in 1787 there were no bicycles, and Burns and Nicol travelled in a horse and carriage.
The contrast between travelling then and now is immense. Burns and I followed the old Drovers Road between Brewer and Aviemore, and then on to the Granton to Dulcie Road, encountering lots of drovers with cattle and little else.
It is thought that Burns may have penned this epigram, Rough Roads, following his tour of the Highlands. I'm now arrived, thanks to the gods, through pathways rough and muddy, a certain sign that Mackin roads is no this people's study. Although I'm not wi' scripture crammed, I'm sure the Bible says that heedless sinners shall be damned unless they mend their ways. Burns and Nicholl set off from Brewer on the 2nd of September, but it was late evening on the 3rd they arrived at Dulcie, a journey time in excess of 24 hours, with stops at Dalwhinnie, Aviemore and Castle Grant. By my reckoning on today's roads, I could do the journey in 6 hours, perhaps even in a shorter time if my rear seat passenger was fit, sober and any good at cycling.
Had Burns and I had the benefit of modern day transport, it would have considerably shortened our journey time, but we would not have benefited from the beautiful, splendid Highland countryside.
Tuesday, down by the Findhorn to Codder, saw the bed in which King Duncan was stabbed and dined at Kilrock. Then, like all visitors to the Highlands since, onwards to Fort George, Inverness, Loch Ness and Urquhart Castle, but clutching no souvenirs. Thursday, came over Culloden Moor. Reflections on the field of battle was all that Burns could write.
For it was to Nairn they were going for lunch. They had been invited by Dr. Alexander Stewart and a gentleman called Hugh Faulkner to dine with them. Now, we don't know if Burns thought these were potential benefactors, but they certainly had a good lunch. And the thing that Burns records, which is most interesting to him, was the fact that Hugh Faulkner was still a Jacobite. They then headed east, over the hard muir, the country of Macbeth and witches, and Codder Castle in the background, and over and dropping down at Brodie to the Lake of Moray. It's said that in those days that you think well of the Highlands, but you lived in the lake. They were heading for Brodie Castle, the seat of the clan chief of the clan Brodie, James Brodie of Brodie. In his diary, Burns records the fact that James Brodie was truly polite, but not the normal Highland cordiality that he might have expected. Perhaps that's little surprising, because in the previous year, poor James Brodie lost his wife in a fire up there at the top of the castle. The night was spent well, and the two travellers rested well, but the next morning it was to the east again, this time heading for the bridge over Findhorn, a river that they had crossed previously on their tour. And their sights were set on Elgin, the cathedral city.
Nearing Elgin, a worthy burgess takes up the tale.
They moved towards the remains of the Westport Gate into Elgin, a place of little trade and thinly inhabited. Beyond, and now in full view, two tall towers, the Bishops of Murray's medieval place of worship. They inspected the venerable ruins of Elgin Cathedral, and the diary notes a grander effect at first glance than Melrose, but nothing near so beautiful. Perhaps Elgin flattering to deceive. Here stood and still stands Castle Gordon, the palatial home of the Duke and Duchess of Gordon. A fine palace worthy of the generous proprietor. so Burns recorded. At 538 feet long, it was, as he said, the most magnificent edifice north of the Forth. The Duke makes me happier than any great man did. Noble, princely, yet mild, condescending and affable, gay and kind. The Duchess, charming, witty and sensible. God bless them. In Edinburgh, Burns had been much noticed by the noble family. Little doubt, mutual admiration between Burns and the Duke's wife was rekindled. Noted beauty of her day, Duchess Jane announced to Edinburgh society that Burns had swept her off her feet. With this uppermost in mind, Robert confidently presented himself at Castle Gordon at the dinner hour and was welcomed in. He was invited to sit down for dinner. After a few glasses, he rose up and proposed to withdraw, mentioning that Nichol was in the village. The somewhat inebriated Nichol was so annoyed at not being invited that he had already ordered a horse and carriage to take him from Fochabers. Rather than return to Castle Gordon and the advantages of further cementing his friendship with the Gordon family, a furious Burns reluctantly opted to join Nichol. May that obstinate son of Latin prose be cursed to Scotch mild periods, he wrote. Again, because of Nichol, and like as at Blair Athol, Burns had lost an opportunity to strengthen or secure support from those with influence.
Leaving Fochabers, they rode on to Cullen that night in heated silence, like all sensible travellers before or since, avoiding the hotels in Buckie. The next morning they left Murray, never to return. And so to Banff, Old Deer, Peterhead and Ellen. Aberdeen and the Mearns beckoned. At Stonehaven they met Robert Burness, a lawyer cousin of Burns. Onwards to Montrose, the ruined abbey of Arbroath, the low-lying but pleasant town of Dundee, then Perth, Scone Palace, Kinross, and the ferry across the Forth, arriving back in Edinburgh on Sunday, 16th September. Burns concluded, "My journey through the Highlands was perfectly inspiring, and I hope I have laid in a good stock of new poetical ideas from it." In the years after Burns' Highland journey, some great poems were to appear. Tam O'Shanter, A Fond Kiss, Scots wi' Hay, A Man's a Man for a' that. And in the final years of that all too brief life, Burns was to capture so much of the richness of Scotland's past through writing and collecting our country's songs. Through his poems and his songs, Burns says things that are timeless, that are so relevant to our daily lives, and that are universal. And that is why the Elgin Burns Club celebrates and promotes the enduring legacy of Robert Burns. This bench on the top of Lady Hill, Elgin's highest point, not only commemorates Burns' visit to our town, but allows us, as he did, to look out to the wider world.